They called it beautification. I called it an erasure, a quiet war waged with bulldozers and polite emails, camouflaged under HOA letterhead and landscape smiles. It started on a morning that smelled like wet earth and oversteeped coffee, the kind of day that normally would have reminded me of my grandmother humming in the garden, trimming roses she named after jazz singers. But instead of humming, there was roaring steel blades tearing into roots older than most houses in Valley View estates. I didn't even get a warning. One day I was sipping coffee on the porch of the old cabin, watching squirrels chase each other along the fence line. The next, I was watching men in orange vests crush 60 years of memories with hydraulic claws. I stood there in flannel pajamas, stunned, as the garden my grandmother had tended every day of her life was ripped from the earth like it had never mattered. A neighbor jogged past with her designer dog and barely nodded. Another one slowed down his Tesla just enough to glance, just enough to glare, like I had parked a wreck in their curated utopia. That was the day I stopped being a neighbor. I became a blemish, a problem, an eyesore with a deed. You ever been hated politely, smiled at while someone files paperwork to make you disappear? It's a special kind of poison, the HOA kind. They didn't throw rocks at my windows. They sent notices. They didn't slash my tires. They scheduled community aesthetic reviews. No one ever said the word poor. No one said the word outsider. But I heard them every time someone said property value. Funny how no one cared when my grandmother was alive. She was part of the scenery, a quaint old woman with flowers and stories. But after she passed at 92 peacefully, in that very cabin, I inherited 5 acres of what they suddenly remembered was prime land. Land that interrupted their gated circle of million-dollar boxes with its wild trees and cracked porch swing. It was like her death flipped a switch. I was no longer family legacy. I was threat. I never planned to become a land dispute case. I'm a GIS specialist. My world is digital terrain models and boundary lines, not civil courtrooms and permits. I lived in Portland, worked remote, paid taxes. My idea of rebellion was refusing to upgrade my phone for 4 years. But when Grandma died, she left me the property. Not just a will letters, 2 dozens. She wrote like someone who knew this land wouldn't be safe without a guardian. One of them ended with, "If they come for it, Nathan, don't just hold the line, learn it, map it, fight with facts. That's what they'll fear." I didn't understand what she meant until the day Eleanor Winters knocked on my door. She stepped out of a Range Rover wearing sunglasses that cost more than my monthly rent. Her smile was so smooth it creaked. "Mr. Collins," she said, not asking. "I'm Eleanor, president of Valley View Estates, HOA. We'd love to chat about your property." Inside, over instant coffee in a chipped mug that made her recoil just slightly, she offered me a folder and a compliment laced with insult. "This place has charm, rustic charm, but Valley View has standards." Inside the folder, a purchase offer, $300,000, well below market. I didn't even open it. "No thanks." I said, "This land stays in the family." Her smile tensed, like a piano wire. "Think it over," she said, sliding a business card across the table. "We believe in harmony, and harmony requires cooperation." I didn't understand then that cooperation meant surrender. It began slowly, like mold on drywall. One day I came back from the hardware store to find my driveway blocked by a cement truck. "Accident," they said. A week later, a group of surveyors appeared, no county credentials, just reflective vests and expensive equipment. "Boundary clarification," they claimed. Turns out, no such clarification had been ordered. Then I noticed the stakes. The ones that marked the edge of my land had been moved 8 feet inward, a quiet theft. I replaced them. They disappeared again. Then came the silence. Neighbors who used to wave now avoided eye contact. A woman actually crossed the street to avoid me at the farmer's market. One morning, I overheard Eleanor on the patio of the coffee shop across the street. She didn't see me. "He can keep his precious land," she was saying to an older man with a legal folder, "but we'll make sure he can't use it." That's when I felt it for the first time, fear. Not the fear of losing property, but of being erased. Not all at once, not with fire or locks, but little by little, until the world looked the other way when the bulldozers came again. It got worse. The next week, 3 construction vehicles arrived and began tearing up the only road that connected my land to the main street. They said it was maintenance. Showed me paperwork. Fake. I called the county. No record. I called a lawyer. Most refused to take the case. HOAs are tricky. They said, expensive, I meant Gimeso. Finally, someone gave me Sarah Rodriguez's name. Her office looked like it hadn't changed since 1994, but her eyes were sharp. She reviewed everything: photos, permits, deed. Her lips thinned as she read, "They're isolating you," she said, "and unless we move fast, they'll get away with it." She filed for an injunction. A judge granted a temporary halt. For a moment, I exhaled, but Eleanor had already moved to phase 2. Flyers started appearing in mailboxes. My face printed next to the phrase, "dangerous individual." They said I was lowering property values, damaging the aesthetic. One flyer included a quote supposedly from me, "I don't care what happens to your kids." I never said that. I barely talked to anyone. But truth doesn't matter when fear is louder. The county inspectors came next. Anonymous tips, allegations of environmental hazards, broken septic tanks, unsafe structures. Each visit chipped away at me. The wall came last. 6 feet of decorative stone, lined exactly along the path I used to carry tools and groceries in. They called it a community beautification project. I called it what it was: a blockade. They were building a prison without bars. That day, as I struggled to carry a generator through wetland mud, Eleanor pulled up again. She didn't even fake concern this time. "This situation is becoming untenable for you," she said. The next day, I found a heap of debris I dumped at the corner of my land. Rebar, broken tiles, half a toilet. My complaint to the county went nowhere. "Insufficient evidence," they said. And then the box, buried beneath the rubble. Under a dented shovel head and a rusted bike wheel, I found a small metal box, about the size of a shoebox. Inside, plastic sleeved documents, deeds, letters, survey maps. One page was highlighted in yellow, an original deed from 1967. The clause read, "Perpetual unobstructed access shall be preserved by any current or future owner of the surrounding parcels." My grandmother had predicted this. She had encoded resistance into the law itself. That night, I held the document in my hands like it was a weapon. Not a gun, not a shield, but something stronger, a truth too old and too legal to be erased by committee votes or HOA newsletters. I didn't sleep. I read every line, every signature, and I realized this wasn't just about keeping land. It was about refusing to vanish. The next morning, I called Sarah. "This changes everything," she said. "Oh, it had only just begun." I thought the worst had passed. The road was blocked, the wall was up, and I had the clause my grandmother's buried ace about their own. For a few nights, I allowed myself the luxury of believing that the tide had turned. Sarah was optimistic. We'd filed the first injunction. I even managed to spend a full afternoon on the land, cleaning out the shed and fixing a leaky roof panel without someone peeking over the bushes or calling the county on me. I let myself believe they'd reached their limit. That was the mistake. It started with Jason. He lived in the house closest to the eastern side of my land, where the maintenance path used to run before the wall cut it off. We weren't friends, not really, but he was the only one who still nodded hello. And sometimes he stopped to ask about the roses or the weather. One evening he showed up at the property line, holding a copy of a flyer. His face was pale. "They're planning something bigger," he said, eyes darting around like he expected someone to be recording him. "Eleanor's hosting an emergency HOA meeting tomorrow. Not about you, officially, but the topic is community risk mitigation." He looked genuinely uncomfortable. "I thought you should know." I wanted to believe that the flyers and phony complaints had been the high watermark of their campaign. But Jason's visit made something clear: they hadn't lost, they were regrouping. It became obvious 2 days later when a pair of county officials arrived unannounced at my cabin with clipboards and official vests. One of them, a man with perfectly gelled hair and a badge that read Senior Compliance Investigator, told me there had been new reports. "Unsecured chemical storage," he said, pointing toward the gardening shed. "Environmental degradation near the wetland." I stared at him. "You mean the mud path that used to be my access road?" He didn't smile. He pulled out a phone and began snapping pictures. The second official, a woman whose name tag read Angela, took notes. There's also a concern about wildlife disruption. You don't appear to have any fencing separating your activities from the habitat zones. It's my land, I said, trying to hold my voice steady, and it's been open like this for decades. Still, Angela replied, standards evolve. They left me with a 2-page citation list and a thinly veiled thread of fines. But it wasn't the paperwork that rattled me. It was the precision. They knew where to look, what language to use, which codes to invoke. Someone had coached them. I called Sarah that evening. She sounded tired but focused. They're escalating, and they're doing it by the book, or at least, by the appearance of the book. That's what makes this so hard to fight. On paper, it all looks like bureaucracy, but in practice, it's siege warfare. The next blow wasn't legal. It was personal. I came back from the county records office, where we'd spent the better part of the day fighting to retrieve files that mysteriously went missing, to find my mailbox vandalized. Not spray painted, not smashed. It had been disassembled, piece by piece, and left scattered like bones across the gravel. At first, I thought it was a message, but tucked inside what remained of the box post was a photograph, black and white, grainy, clearly taken from a distance. It showed me standing in the garden, holding one of Grandma's old journals. Scribbled in red ink across the top was a single word, careful. No signature, no return address. Just that, a veiled threat wrapped in nostalgia. I didn't tell Sarah about the photo right away. I wasn't sure how to explain the cold that crawled up my spine every time I looked at it. I wasn't scared, not in the conventional way, but something about it felt, invasive. They weren't just trying to evict me anymore. They wanted to break me, undermine my sense of place, my right to even exist on the land. It worked. That night, for the first time since all this started, I left the property and didn't go back. I spent the night in a motel outside of town, restless, staring at beige walls and wondering what my grandmother would think if she saw what her peaceful farm had become. The next day, the power went out, not just in the cabin at the junction box. I called the utility company. They claimed scheduled maintenance. I asked why I hadn't been notified. They said a request had been submitted on my behalf. I never made it. When I asked who did, the call center agent said the request came from the HOA's general office. They must be managing service updates in your area. She said. I laughed. They're trying to delete me. She paused, unsure what to say. I'll open a ticket, she offered softly. The isolation was working. My work had already been affected. Remote GIS work requires internet, electricity, and peace of mind, none of which I had left. My employer, initially sympathetic, grew wary. We've received anonymous reports. They said, about your conduct. There's concern about how this may affect the company's reputation. I tried to explain. They listened politely, then placed me on unpaid leave pending review. I hung up the call and sat for a full hour on the cabin steps, the silence around me thick and mocking. It wasn't just about the land anymore. They were unraveling me thread by thread. Jason visited again, this time under cover of dusk. He brought something wrapped in brown paper. You need to see this, he whispered. Inside was a printed email thread between Eleanor and several HOA board members. Jason had accessed it from a shared HOA portal he wasn't supposed to have access to anymore. In it, they discussed finalizing the isolation effort, and most chillingly, a phrase underlined by Eleanor herself. He'll fold. Everyone folds once they're cut off from the grid. That phrase burned into me like acid. This wasn't just bureaucratic maneuvering. This was psychological warfare. I showed the email to Sarah the next morning. Her jaw tightened. They've overplayed, she said. This is the kind of direct intent we can use, but we'll need more meant risk. So we got strategic. We set up surveillance. Jason installed discrete audio devices near the Valley View clubhouse. I started recording every conversation I had on site. We even began tracing the mail trail, trying to figure out who, if anyone, inside the county office was passing information to the HOA. Then came the night of the false report. I was asleep in the motel room when pounding at the door jerked me awake. 2 officers, warrant in hand. Nathan Collins, you are under investigation for trespassing and destruction of HOA property. One of them said, his tone flat, we have footage. The footage was laughable grainy, time-stamped at 300 am, showing a hooded figure allegedly cutting part of the perimeter fence. I hadn't been on the property in 2 days, but intent didn't matter. The video existed, I was cuffed, booked, and spent the night in holding until Sarah could arrange bail. Back at the motel, the world felt smaller. I had no job, no power, no access to my land, and now a pending criminal charge. But what I did have, thanks to Jason's leak, was motive. Eleanor wasn't just protecting property values. She had a personal history with this land. Her failed promotion at Westlake, the company that once tried to buy my grandmother's land. This was revenge dressed as real estate. And then we struck oil. Jason, braver now, managed to record Eleanor at a board celebration dinner. She thought the fight was over. She spoke freely, too freely. She boasted about forged surveys, about draining the lake to build a retail center, even joked about bribing an inspector with box seat tickets and bourbon. It was all on tape. And with that, the tide turned not in headlines or courtrooms. Not yet, but in the deeper way wars shift before the public sees it. Eleanor had gone from puppet master to liability, and she didn't know it yet. But I did, and I was ready. Tell you shit, I didn't realize how close I was to the edge until I started wondering what it would feel like to just give in. I had always seen myself as someone steady, someone who kept his emotions at arm's length and trusted in structure maps, documents, coordinates. But nothing about this fight could be mapped. The lines were constantly moving. Truth was subjective. Law was optional. And the deeper I sank, the harder it became to imagine climbing back out. Sarah tried to keep me anchored. She was tireless, pulling records, filing motions, tracking down obscure case law at midnight. But even she had her limits. I could hear it in her voice when I told her about the false arrest, the loss of power and water, the employer turning its back on me. She didn't say hang in there this time. She just said, we need to change tactics. I didn't understand what she meant at first. I thought she was talking about the next court filing. But she was talking about something else, something riskier. They've built their strategy assuming you'll keep pushing back and through official channels. She said, what if we stop doing that? What if we let them think they've won? It sounded like surrender. It felt like betrayal. But the more she explained it, the more it made sense. They had overreached. They had paper trails, emails, doctored footage, fake permits, a history of coordinated harassment. But none of it would matter if we didn't survive long enough to expose it. So we staged the fall. The letter was short, formal. I informed the HOA that I was withdrawing my legal challenges and would be willing to enter sale negotiations. I didn't use flowery language. I didn't ask for sympathy. Just enough resignation to seem authentic. Eleanor responded within hours. She didn't call Sarah. She called me directly. Her voice was syrupy, a thin mass barely covering her delight. Nathan, I'm so glad you've come to your senses. She said, let's finalize this. We can offer $200,000 clean title, quick closure. I trust that's acceptable. I agreed to meet, told her I needed time to gather my grandmother's personal items from the property before transferring ownership. She was generous in that way that only winners can be. Take your time, she said. We'll have everything ready for Monday. She even offered to send someone to help me pack. What she didn't know was that I was no longer living at the motel. Jason had offered his guest house off the books, quiet, and most importantly, within walking distance of Valley View's community clubhouse. That's where the next move played out. Jason had planted audio recording devices during one of the HOA's celebratory planning sessions. Apparently, my capitulation had unlocked the next phase of their grand vision. I sat in his dimly lit living room that night, headphones on, listening to Eleanor's voice glide through the speakers like a villain rehearsing her monologue. We'll drain the lake first, she said casually over clinking wine glasses. Then we can push the parking lot into phase 2. That little pond is just a mosquito trap anyway. Another voice chimed in, Howard Pierce, her longtime legal ally. What about the wetlands designation? Eleanor laughed. Taken care of. County contacts signed off. Our guy at zoning expedited the variance. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was basking. We recorded everything. And the next morning, we delivered it not to the police, not to the HOA, but to Carmen Washington, a local investigative journalist with a reputation for burning bridges and printing receipts. Carmen was sharp, relentless, and had been sniffing around Valley View for months with no solid leads. When she heard what we had, she barely blinked before saying, "I'm in." Within 72 hours, her expose was live. HOA president caught on tape, admitting to wetland destruction plan. The headline read, it included audio clips, legal filings, satellite images from my GIS files showing the proposed expansions, and quotes from whistleblowers. Jason's name wasn't used, but his courage pulsed through every paragraph. The fallout was immediate. Valley View residents, who had once glared at me like I was a roach in their spotless kitchen, now turned on Eleanor. Property values tanked. The HOA board splintered. Lawsuits were whispered. Some members started contacting attorneys on their own, trying to shield themselves from what was clearly becoming a legal wildfire. That's when Howard came forward. I didn't expect it. He showed up one night, unannounced, soaked from the rain, carrying a box of documents, like a man walking into confession. "I'm done," he said. "I've helped her cover too much. I can't anymore." Over the next 2 hours, he revealed everything: how Eleanor had used his past misconduct as leverage, how she had orchestrated the fake surveys, the bribes, the boundary changes. She knew about the clause, he said, handing me a worn copy of the original deed. She was terrified of Anna. That's why she pushed so hard to isolate you. She knew if she didn't, she'd lose everything. But it was what came next that stunned me. He pointed to a section of the deed that hadn't been part of our original strategy. It was buried in legal language dense, obscure, but it contained something extraordinary. A reversion clause, a conditional legal trap my grandmother had inserted decades ago. If access to her land was ever deliberately blocked by adjacent development, ownership of specific common areas would automatically transfer to her estate, namely the community entrance and the Central Park, the very heart of Valley View. My grandmother hadn't just protected her land. She had booby-trapped the entire subdivision against predatory expansion. I sat there in silence, the weight of her foresight pressing against my chest. She hadn't trusted the system. She had engineered her own. Sarah was ecstatic. We began compiling our case for court. Every violation, every doctored survey, every statement from Eleanor bragging about manipulating environmental permits. My GIS skills finally had a battlefield. I built layered maps showing original boundaries, altered versions, utility routes, wildlife patterns. Carmen published a second story, this one focused on the clause. Developer outmaneuvered by legacy land deed. The term Collins Clause started trending on local forums. By the time we filed the motion to activate the reversion clause, Valley View's HOA was in full collapse. But Eleanor wasn't finished. She played one final card. Late one night, Jason's cameras caught her at the community gate, directing a private crew to bulldoze the entrance road, a last-ditch effort to destroy evidence. Or maybe just an act of rage. She was arrested on the spot. Local news aired the footage on repeat. A community once defined by manicured hedges and silent hierarchy had become ground zero for a modern property war. And somehow, I was still standing in the middle of it, muddy, exhausted, and, for the first time, not afraid. The court hearing came quickly. Judge Reynolds was direct, clinical, and unflinching. After 2 hours of arguments, she issued her ruling. This court finds deliberate obstruction of access in violation of the 1967 deed. As per the reversion clause, ownership of designated common areas is hereby transferred to Nathan Collins. The room gasped. Eleanor's face didn't change. She just stared ahead like the verdict hadn't reached her ears yet. Outside the courthouse, I stood next to Sarah and Carmen as the press circled like bees. I didn't say much. Just this land protected my family for generations. My grandmother planted more than roses here. She planted a boundary, one they couldn't bulldoze. That night, I walked the edge of the lake, now legally mine again, and thought of her hands in the dirt, her laughter when the first blooms came in spring. I had inherited land, but more than that, I had inherited defiance. And that, finally, was enough. When Judge Reynolds read the ruling aloud, officially transferring ownership of Valley View's prized common areas to me, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt the air leave the room. Not just for Eleanor, who sat motionless like a statue cracked from the inside, but for every HOA board member, Every resident who had bought into the illusion that wealth and concrete could erase legacy. The courtroom did erupt in applause. There was only silence, thick and stunned. I stepped outside without a word, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a reckoning. They had fired every weapon they had: lies, legal traps, character assassination, and still, I was standing. But I also knew what that ruling had cost me. I hadn't just defended land. I had become its shield, its lightning rod, its living claws. The day after the verdict, everything shifted. Realtors pulled listings overnight. Residents flooded the HOA's inbox with panicked questions. What does this mean? Can he restrict access? Is our property now worthless? Eleanor, ever the tactician, tried to spin the narrative. She sent a community-wide email titled "Temporary Inconvenience, Long-Term Solution." In it, she called the ruling a procedural hiccup and assured residents that an appeal was already underway. But there was no appeal. Sarah had checked. And more importantly, there was no path forward for Eleanor that didn't involve accountability. Jason told me about the HOA emergency meeting later that week. It was chaos, he said, half smiling. People were shouting. Someone brought a printout of the article from Carmen's expose and waved it in her face. You should have seen it. One resident, an elderly woman with a thick southern drawl, apparently shouted, "You told us this was just a garden path dispute." It was the first time Eleanor had been publicly challenged, and it broke the dam. Stories began surfacing. Quiet ones at first. A couple who had been fined for painting their shutters the wrong shade of white. A retired teacher forced to remove a handmade bench from her front yard. Parents who had been reprimanded for their children playing too loudly near the park. Eleanor's version of community was order at any cost. And now, people were realizing that order had come with a price they hadn't seen until it was too late. That night, someone slipped an anonymous envelope under Jason's door. Inside were financial records, actual spreadsheets from HOA accounts. What they revealed was staggering diverted funds, unapproved expenditures, payments to consultants with no clear scope of work. One name appeared repeatedly in the payee column: Eleanor Winters. Sarah and I added the new evidence to our growing file. But more than the numbers, it was the note scrawled in uneven handwriting that stood out. Not everyone on the board agrees with what's happening. Ready for the real trap, trigger the reversion clause. The message was clear. Someone inside the enemy camp wanted this to end, and they were giving us permission to finish it. Still, we had to be precise. The deed clause had given me legal control over Valley View's Central Park and main entrance, but Eleanor still controlled the perception. And if we misstepped, she'd use that perception to paint me as a tyrant, an outsider who had come to strangle their community. So we did what she never expected. We invited dialogue. I sent an official letter to the new interim board, Jason now acting as president, requesting a formal meeting to discuss the future of the disputed areas. The agenda was simple: 3 non-negotiable conditions for returning control. We met under a white canopy in the community park, just feet from the rose bushes Eleanor had once ordered removed for being non-compliant. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. I stood with Sarah and Jason at my side, facing a half circle of board members and concerned residents. I didn't speak like a victor. I spoke like a steward. I'm not here to punish anyone. I began, but I am here to ensure that what happened to me, what nearly erased my grandmother's legacy, never happens to anyone again. Then I laid out my terms. First, the establishment of a permanent conservation easement, protecting not only my land but the wetlands, lake, and interconnected natural areas within and around Valley View. No development, no drainage, no beautification projects, only preservation. Second, architectural and access rights for my planned home, non-negotiable, permanent, and free from future HOA interference. I would build, live, and exist on my land without needing aesthetic approval or clearance to use my own driveway. Third, the formation of a neighborhood oversight committee, composed of residents, with binding authority over any major development decision. No more secret meetings, no more unchecked power. There was murmuring, hesitation, but not defiance. They knew what the alternative was. I had control, legal, absolute control. I could have locked the gates, torn up the park, left the entrance road overgrown and choked with weeds. I could have made Valley View a cautionary tale in every real estate seminar from here to Seattle, but I wasn't interested in revenge. I wanted restoration. The board agreed unanimously. We signed the agreement 2 days later, notarized and filed with the county. The conservation easement was drafted in full legal armor, co-signed by a state environmental agency that Carmen had connected us to. The wetlands were safe, the lake was protected. Instead of building fences, we planted trees, native ones, oaks, maples, and a new ring of rose bushes grown from cuttings I'd kept in a cooler through the worst weeks of the siege. As Valley View slowly healed, Eleanor's life unraveled. The DA's investigation, sparked by our recordings and Howard's testimony, expanded quickly. The arrest for attempted destruction of community property was just the beginning. More charges followed: fraud, bribery, falsification of public documents. Her trial was pending, but her future was written in the ink of every forged survey, every coerced signature. She left the state quietly, not in disgrace, because that would have required her to acknowledge guilt, but in silence. Her name was removed from HOA documents. Her email address deactivated. Her shadow, however, would take longer to lift. Howard, in exchange for full cooperation and testimony, was granted partial immunity. He used his second chance to do something unexpected. He established a legal aid foundation, small, underfunded at first, but focused entirely on helping individual landowners fight corporate developers and weaponized HOAs. Your grandmother won, Nathan. He told me the day he delivered the foundation's first printed flyer. I just wish I'd had the backbone to stand beside her back then. I nodded, understanding more than I could say. I finally broke ground on my house that fall. A modest cottage, wood and stone, no plastic siding, no towering fences. It faced the lake, its porch wrapping around like an embrace. The centerpiece was the rose garden, planted carefully with the same rhythm my grandmother once used jazz records on a portable speaker. The soft hum of soil turned by hand. And patience, always patience. That winter, snow fell softly on the land, blanketing the scars of battle in white. I stood on the porch one morning, coffee in hand, watching children from the neighborhood run along the lake trail. Their parents walk behind, waving, smiling the kind of smile that doesn't hide anything. The HOA sent a thank you letter. Not a formal one, a real one, signed by board members and families alike. They called the land a sanctuary, a lesson, the soul of Valley View. I pinned it to my office wall next to two framed items, the reversion clause, in all its legal glory, and a photo of my grandmother standing in her rose garden, sleeves rolled up, dirt on her hands, eyes fierce with quiet certainty. The land had never needed saving. It had just needed someone willing to listen, to stay, to not fold. And now, as her roses bloomed again in the spring, and the breeze carried the scent of something both old and undefeated, I understood she hadn't just left me property. She had left me a mission, one that I had, finally, completed. Spring came slowly, like the land was learning how to breathe again. The lake thawed in quiet ripples, the rose cuttings began to root, and for the first time in months, there was no motion sensor alert in the middle of the night, no surprise visit from county inspectors, no hostile glare from HOA board members. The war that had threatened to erase my inheritance, my peace, and in some ways my identity, was finally over. But peace doesn't feel like fireworks. It feels like stillness, like waking up and not checking your front door for threats, like walking your land with both hands in your pockets instead of holding a phone set to record just in case. I didn't celebrate, not in the usual sense. I rebuilt, quietly, methodically. Each board of the new porch, each garden bed, each legal filing that finalized the easement protections. Every act was a response to the destruction they'd tried to cause. Restoration isn't poetic. It's slow, deliberate, and necessary. A month after the ruling, Jason came by with a small, hand-carved sign that said Collins Preserve. He said it was a thank you from some of the Valley View families. I didn't ask which ones. I didn't need to. The fact that it existed was enough. I mounted it near the entrance path that Eleanor once tried to pave over. The irony of it still made me shake my head. Her vision had been a pristine, commercialized enclave, gated, sterile, controllable. And now her actions had turned this land into a symbol of resistance and reform. Carmen's final article, published just weeks after Eleanor was formally indicted, called it a turning point in local development politics. Her reporting reached the state legislature. Not long after, a new bill informally named the Collins Property Rights Act was introduced. It mandated greater transparency in HOA governance, stricter accountability for environmental impact, and enhanced notification rights for adjacent property owners. The language of the bill included direct references to my case, citing systematic obstruction of legal access and the weaponization of residential associations. I read it twice. I didn't smile. I just felt the weight of it. The kind of weight my grandmother had always carried in her shoulders but never complained about. Sarah, now something of a celebrity attorney in property rights circles, took on new clients with renewed energy. She used my case as a blueprint in presentations and lectures, calling it a living lesson in legal foresight. I kept my distance from the spotlight. Publicity wasn't why I fought. I stayed on the land. I built my home. The cottage was exactly what I'd imagined: small, intentional, open to the light. The back porch looked over the lake, and from there I could see where the property line once blurred into conflict, now stitched back together with grass, wildflowers. In time, I kept the generator Eleanor once mocked. I didn't need it anymore, but I kept it anyway, as a reminder of the days I had to carry power in my own two arms, because someone decided I wasn't entitled to what was mine. But closure didn't come all at once. It came in layers. One of those layers was Howard. He showed up again on a cold morning in March, holding two things: a flash drive and a letter. "This was the last piece," he said, setting them on my porch table, "and it's not mine to keep." The flash drive contained Eleanor's original development proposal, not the one filed publicly, the real one. It outlined a massive commercial expansion that would have decimated not only my land, but the entire surrounding ecosystem. Her plans included draining the lake, rerouting stormwater runoff through the wetlands, and constructing a multi-tier parking lot on top of what had once been my grandmother's favorite fishing spot. I felt something inside me collapse quietly when I read that. This had never just been about access or aesthetics. It had been annihilation disguised as progress. The letter, in contrast, was handwritten, from Eleanor, dated 2 weeks before her arrest. It wasn't an apology. Not really. It was an admission of calculation. She described my grandmother as obstinate, clever, dangerous to the precedent we were trying to set. She didn't express remorse. She expressed frustration that she had been outmaneuvered. The letter ended with one line I read over and over again: "I didn't lose to you, Nathan. I lost to her." She was right. I had just followed the map my grandmother left behind. The real architect of all of this, of the protection, the legal traps, the reversion clause, had been an old woman with dirt under her nails and a mind like a vault. She saw this coming. Maybe not the exact shape of it, but the pattern, the greed, the slow, suffocating creep of engineered compliance. And she'd built defenses the way other people build fences, with purpose. I kept her journals in the study, stacked in chronological order, full of notes, sketches, legal ideas. Sometimes, I opened them not for strategy, but just to remember her voice in the margins. Protect the lake, protect the bees, protect the past. On the 1-year anniversary of the court decision, I hosted a neighborhood gathering. Not a festival, just a picnic. Kids ran along the water's edge. Adults brought folding chairs and homemade pies. There were no speeches, just quiet gratitude. Jason, now the fully elected HOA president, gave me a wooden plaque. It read, "For courage, clarity, and reminding us what community really means." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the lake, I sat on the porch and watched the golden light settle over the water. I thought of all the nights I sat there alone, wondering if I was losing my mind, if the land was worth it, if legacy was just a romantic word for stubbornness. But watching those families now, kids barefoot, laughing, adults lingering in conversation, I knew this wasn't just about land. It was about narrative, about who gets to decide what matters and what doesn't. They had tried to write me out, my grandmother, me, this land, and we had written ourselves back in line by line, clause by clause, root by root. Inside my office, on the wall beside the deed and her photo, I added one more frame. It held a simple phrase, typed in courier font, printed on paper that had yellowed slightly from the sun. Land doesn't just belong to you. If you care for it long enough, it starts caring for you. That had been her mantra, a warning, a promise, a compass. Now it was mine, as the first roses of spring opened along the fence line, soft, stubborn, beautiful. I realized something else. They hadn't just tried to destroy my inheritance. They had awakened it, and now it was in bloom.